He was ridiculed by every court in Europe, a man obsessed. He bankrupted his treasury, sacrificed his armies, and traded away vital territories, all for a single piece of paper. He died in agony from a plate of mushrooms. His life's work an absolute failure, leaving his daughter defenseless as his empire was torn to pieces. And yet this is the man who fathered one of the greatest empresses in history. His name was Emperor Charles VI. How could this father's desperate, failed gamble be the very thing that saved his dynasty? To understand the ghost that haunted Charles VI, you have to understand the family he was born into. The House of Habsburg was less a family and more of a European institution. For centuries, they had been the continent's landlords, a sprawling dynasty of kings and emperors, who, through a dizzying series of brilliantly advantageous marriages, had come to rule a truly bewildering collection of lands. Think of it less as a single, unified country, like modern-day Britain or France, and more as a personal portfolio of titles. By the time Charles was born in 1685, his father, Emperor Leopold I, was Archduke of Austria, King of Hungary, King of Bohemia, King of Croatia, and Holy Roman Emperor, which gave him a kind of ceremonial yet potent overlordship over the patchwork of states in Germany and northern Italy. This empire was a multi-ethnic, multilingual, multicultural behemoth, stitched together by a single thread, the Habsburg male line. Its capital, Vienna, was becoming a glittering jewel of Baroque music and architecture, a bastion of devout Catholicism, standing against the Protestant north and the Ottoman threat to the east. But this glittering facade masked a deep structural fragility. The whole thing was held together by tradition, loyalty, and most importantly, the reliable birth of sons. And for the Habsburgs, their greatest rivals, the Bourbons of France, were always watching. The defining political reality of Charles's youth, the one that would shape his entire destiny, was a ticking clock in Madrid. In Spain, his distant cousin Charles II was dying. And Charles II was a tragic figure, the living embodiment of the dangers of Habsburg inbreeding. He was physically disabled, mentally impaired, and, crucially, completely impotent. He had no children. He would be the last Habsburg to ever rule Spain. This wasn't just a family sadness, it was a European crisis. The Spanish Empire, though in decline, was still the largest in the world. It included not just Spain itself, but the southern Netherlands, modern-day Belgium, vast territories in Italy, Naples, Sicily, Milan, and the colossal silver-rich colonies of the Americas. The question that kept every diplomat and king in Europe awake at night was, who would get it all? There were two main claimants. The first was Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, who claimed it on behalf of his grandson Philip. The second was our Charles's father, Leopold I, the Holy Roman Emperor, who claimed it for his family. Both kings had Spanish princesses as mothers and wives, making the legal claims a tangled, impenetrable mess. The nightmare scenario for the rest of Europe, particularly for the maritime powers like Britain and the Netherlands, was that either of these two great families would get the whole prize. If France got it, a new superstate would be formed, stretching from the Atlantic to the Rhine, dominating all of Europe. If the Austrian Habsburgs got it, it would be a return to the 16th century, when Charles V, our Charles's ancestor, ruled over an empire so vast he famously said the sun never set on it. The balance of power, a concept for which millions would die, was at stake. This was the world Charles VI was born into. He wasn't even the first son, he was the spare. His father, Leopold I, was a complex man, deeply pious, indecisive, a lover of music, who would rather be in his chapel than on a battlefield. His mother, Eleanor Magdalene, was equally devout and fiercely intelligent. His older brother Joseph, born 7 years earlier, was the golden boy. Joseph was everything Charles was not. He was charming, energetic, a charismatic military leader, a bit of a womanizer, and a pragmatic reformer. He was the heir. Charles, by contrast, was serious, formal, pious like his father, and possessed a deeply ingrained sense of Habsburg dignity. He was educated by Jesuits, who instilled in him an unshakable, almost rigid Catholicism, and a belief in his divine right to rule. He was intelligent, spoke multiple languages, and even inherited his father's musical talent, becoming a competent composer and musician himself. But he was always in Joseph's shadow. Joseph was being groomed to rule the complex heart of Europe in Vienna. Charles was being prepared for a different and, in many ways, more dangerous destiny. The family's grand plan, cooked up by his father Leopold, was to split the inheritance. They would fight the coming war to ensure the Bourbons didn't get Spain, and when they won, Joseph would inherit Austria and the Holy Roman Empire, while Charles would get Spain. He would pack his bags, move to Madrid, and refound the Spanish Habsburg line. From his earliest childhood, Charles was not taught to be an Austrian archduke. He was taught to be a Spanish king. He was surrounded by Spanish advisors. He learned Spanish customs. He was drilled in the rigid, almost fossilized etiquette of the Spanish court. He was, by the age of 16, Carlos III, the rightful king of Spain, at least in his family's eyes. In 1700, the ticking clock finally stopped. Charles II of Spain died. His will, extracted by French diplomats on his deathbed, named Louis XIV's grandson, Philip, as his sole heir. The Sun King, seeing his chance to achieve total dominance, accepted the will, famously declaring to his court, "Gentlemen, the Pyrenees no longer exist." It was a declaration of war. In 1701, the War of the Spanish Succession exploded across Europe. It was a truly global conflict, the First World War in many ways, with battles ranging from the fields of Flanders to the colonies in America. Britain, the Netherlands, and most of the German states, terrified of a French-Spanish superstate, joined Leopold and the Austrian Habsburgs in an alliance to put Carlos III, our Charles, on the Spanish throne. For Charles himself, this was no abstract political game. This was his job. In 1703, at the age of 18, his father formally renounced his own claims to Spain, and Charles was proclaimed king. He set off on a long, winding journey, first to England to confer with Queen Anne, then to Portugal, the only part of the Iberian Peninsula that had sided with him. In 1704, he landed in Lisbon with a small allied army. He was 19 years old. He was a king without a kingdom, a serious, pious, slightly stiff young man tasked with conquering a country that, for the most part, didn't want him. The next 7 years of Charles's life were a trial by fire. He was no military genius like his brother Joseph, who by this time had become emperor in 1705 after their father Leopold's death. But he showed surprising personal courage. He was present at sieges. He endured the brutal heat and poverty of a war-torn country. He was in these years tough and resilient. His primary base of operations became Barcelona. The region of Catalonia, with a fierce independent streak and a deep distrust of the centralizing French Bourbons, largely embraced him. And for a few fleeting years, Charles truly was a king. He established a glittering court in Barcelona, a small slice of Vienna transplanted to the Mediterranean. He minted coins with his face on them. He patronized the arts, and he held formal audiences. And it was from this Spanish court that he secured his future wife. His brother Joseph arranged his marriage to a beautiful German princess, Elizabeth Christine of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel. She was clever, charming, and in a significant complication, a Protestant. This, for the devout Charles, was an almost unbearable barrier. He refused to even meet her until she converted. The pressure on this young woman was immense. She wrote desperate letters, but eventually, for the sake of a crown, she relented. She formally converted to Catholicism in 1707 and made the perilous journey to Spain. She arrived in Barcelona in 1708, and they were married. By all accounts, it was a genuine love match. Charles, so often formal and reserved, was deeply devoted to his Lisette. She was described as having dazzling white skin, so perfect that the Spanish, unaccustomed to such a fair complexion, nicknamed her La Blanquita. For 3 years, they lived in Barcelona as King and Queen of Spain, their prospects rising and falling with the tide of war. The Allied armies, led by the brilliant Duke of Marlborough and Prince Eugene of Savoy, won spectacular victories in the north at Blenheim, Ramillies, and Oudenarde. It seemed for a moment that they might actually win. They even captured Madrid twice, though they were unable to hold it. Charles was committed. He was learning to be Spanish. His entire identity, his future, his family, all of it was tied to this peninsula. He was not the emperor. He was not the head of the Habsburgs. He was the founder of a new Spanish branch. That was the plan. Then in April 1711, a messenger arrived in Barcelona, exhausted, carrying letters sealed in black wax. The news was catastrophic, world-changing, and for Charles, profoundly personal. His older brother, Joseph I, the brilliant, charismatic emperor, had been in Vienna. He had contracted smallpox, and at the age of 32, he was dead. Joseph had no sons. He left behind 2 young daughters. Suddenly, the entire carefully constructed Habsburg plan, the one that had defined Charles's entire life and plunged a continent into war, was in ashes. There was only one male Habsburg left. Charles, the man who had spent a decade trying to conquer Spain, was now, by that very same ancient law of succession he was fighting for, the ruler of Austria, Hungary, Bohemia, and the new Holy Roman Emperor. This wasn't a victory. It was a disaster. It was a disaster because Charles's new reality was the one thing his allies, Britain, the Netherlands, Savoy, feared just as much as a Bourbon superstate. If Charles, who was still fighting for the Spanish crown, now also became emperor, the sun never sets empire of Charles V would be reborn. The balance of power would be just as shattered, only in the other direction. His allies, the very men who had been shedding blood for his claim, immediately began to have second thoughts. The war had been fought to stop a union of France and Spain. It was now being fought, it seemed, to create a union of Austria and Spain. In London, the government, which had been the war's most enthusiastic supporter, fell. A new war-weary Tory government rose to power, and they immediately began to seek peace with France. Charles was cornered. He was 26 years old. He had just lost his brother. His wife, Elizabeth Christine, was still in Barcelona, and she was pregnant. He was facing an impossible choice. If he stayed in Spain, he would be abandoning his family's ancient heartlands in Austria and Hungary. He would be forfeiting the imperial crown. If he left Spain to claim the imperial title in Vienna, he would be abandoning the kingdom he had spent his entire adult life fighting for, the people of Catalonia who had supported him, and the dream that had been drilled into him since childhood. He tried for a few desperate months to have it all. He told his allies he would not leave. He would rule his new vast empire from Barcelona. It was a fantasy. His allies began to pull their troops out. The British, in what the Catalans saw as a profound betrayal, signed a separate peace with France, agreeing to let Louis XIV's grandson, Philip, keep the Spanish crown after all, on the condition that the thrones of France and Spain would never be united. The war's entire purpose had shifted under Charles's feet. He was no longer a candidate. He was an obstacle. In December 1711, leaving his weeping wife behind in Barcelona as his regent, a symbolic pledge that he would one day return, Charles VI boarded a ship. He sailed from the warm Mediterranean sun back to the heart of a cold, grieving continent. He was no longer Carlos III, the adventurous young king. He was now Charles VI, Holy Roman Emperor, ruler of the vast, complex, and deeply troubled Habsburg monarchy. He had failed to win Spain, but he had inherited an empire. And though he didn't know it yet, he had also inherited the central, terrifying problem of his brother's short reign. Joseph had died without a son, and Charles, at this moment, had no son either. The anxiety that would come to define his life, the one that would drive him to distraction and ruin, was just beginning to take root. He arrived in Vienna as the sole fragile branch on a dying family tree, and he knew with chilling certainty that the survival of his entire 1,000-year-old dynasty rested quite literally on him alone. When Charles VI rode into Vienna in December 1711, it wasn't a hero's return, it was a funeral procession. He was returning to a capital draped in mourning for his brother, the Emperor Joseph, and he was returning to an empire that was now suddenly his responsibility. The 26-year-old man who had left, full of youthful ambition to conquer a Mediterranean kingdom, was gone. In his place was a sovereign weighed down by the crowns of Austria, Hungary, and Bohemia, and the ancient heavy title of Holy Roman Emperor. The contrast to his life in Barcelona couldn't have been more stark. There, he was Carlos, surrounded by the warmth and color of a Spanish court he had built himself. Here, he was Karl, thrust into the notoriously rigid, formal, and ancient Habsburg court etiquette, known as Spanish's Hof ceremonial. It was a system so complex, so archaic, that every second of his day was prescribed. Who could speak to him? How they had to bow, how he ate his meals, how he was dressed. It was a suffocating golden cage. And for a man already naturally serious and pious, this formality only served to isolate him further. He was also returning to a political nightmare. His allies, the British and the Dutch, the very nations who had funded his war in Spain, were now actively negotiating against him. They had spent a decade fighting to prevent a union of France and Spain, and they had absolutely no intention of letting Charles, by a quirk of fate, create a union of Austria and Spain. Charles was incandescent with rage. He felt betrayed. He had been their candidate. He refused to give up his claim to the Spanish throne, the one he had bled for more than a year. He stubbornly refused to join the peace talks, but his allies simply left him. In 1713, Britain, the Netherlands, Prussia, and Savoy all signed the Treaty of Utrecht with France. The terms were a knife in Charles's heart. Louis XIV's grandson, Philip V, was confirmed as King of Spain and its colonies. The war was, in effect, over, and Charles had lost. The Pyrenees, which Louis XIV had declared non-existent, were now firmly in place with a Bourbon on either side. Charles, isolated and furious, tried to fight on alone for another year, but his empire was exhausted. His treasury was empty. He simply couldn't. In 1714, he was forced to sign his own peace, the Treaty of Rastatt. It was a bitter, bitter pill. He was forced finally to renounce his claim to the Spanish crown. He was the king who had failed. But there was a consolation prize. As compensation, Charles and the Austrian Habsburgs were given most of the Spanish territories in Italy, Naples, Milan, and Sardinia, as well as the Spanish Netherlands, what we would call Belgium. On paper, it looked like a victory. The Habsburg Empire had actually expanded, but Charles knew the truth. He had gained a collection of disconnected, hard-to-defend territories, and he had lost the single, unified crown he had been raised to win. He had swapped a kingdom for a collection of provinces, and, most painfully, he had failed. This sense of failure, the humiliation of being abandoned by his allies and outmaneuvered by the French, would fester in him. It would fuel his paranoia, and it would forge in him a white-hot, obsessive resolve to never be this weak, this vulnerable again. While Charles was grappling with the shattered pieces of his imperial dream, his wife, the woman he adored, was still in Barcelona. He had left his Lisette behind as his regent, a symbolic pawn in his desperate, failed bid to keep Spain. She had been there for nearly 2 years without him, a lonely empress in a kingdom that was no longer hers, surrounded by Catalans who knew they were about to be abandoned to the vengeance of the new Bourbon king. Finally, in one A713, she too made the long, sad journey back to Vienna, where she was reunited with her husband. Now the full weight of the dynasty fell squarely onto her shoulders, because the crisis that had begun with Joseph's death was not resolved. It was just pending. Joseph had left 2 daughters, his nieces Maria Josepha and Maria Amalia. Charles himself had no children at all. The entire vast, sprawling Habsburg Empire had a line of succession that consisted of 2 young girls. And in an age of ruthless kings where female succession was seen as a weakness, an invitation to invasion, this was a 5-alarm fire. The moment Charles arrived in Vienna, this problem became his obsession, and he had a very specific, very personal reason to be terrified. Back in 1703, before this whole mess had begun, his father, Leopold I, had sat down with his 2 sons, Joseph and Charles, and made them sign a secret family contract. It was called the Pactum Mutuum, the Mutual Pact of Succession. It was a contingency plan. It laid out the rules just in case. It said that if Joseph had no sons, his daughters would inherit. And only if Joseph's line died out completely would the inheritance pass to Charles and his children. Now think about what this meant for Charles in 1713. He was emperor. But according to the very pact he himself had signed, he was essentially just a placeholder. The rightful heir to all his lands was not his own future child, but his niece, Maria Josepha. If he had a daughter, she would get nothing. His brother's line came first. Charles, the man who believed in the sacred, divine right of his own blood, could not tolerate this. He was the emperor. His children, his blood, must come first. So on April 19, 1713, just 2 years after his brother's death and before he had any children of his own, Charles VI gathered his ministers in secret. He did not consult the diets of his kingdoms. He did not ask his nobles. He simply produced a new document. He called it the Pragmatic Sanction. It was a legal and political bomb. It unilaterally overturned the 1703 Pact. It declared 2 things, simple and revolutionary. First, the Habsburg monarchy was indivisible, inseparable, and perpetual. It could never be split up again. Second, and most critically, it declared that if Charles himself had no sons, the succession would pass to his eldest daughter. His brother's daughters, his nieces, were pushed down the line. It was a private family betrayal, wrapped in the language of statecraft. He was, in effect, disinheriting his nieces in favor of a daughter who didn't even exist yet. It was a staggering gamble driven by pride, dynastic obsession, and that lingering fear of failure he'd brought back from Spain. He was rewriting the rules of his own family to ensure his own direct line would prevail. For now, the document remained a secret, known only to his closest circle. It was a desperate what if. But the real solution, the one the whole empire prayed for, was much simpler. He just needed to have a son. For 3 years, the court waited. The pressure on the 22-year-old Empress Elizabeth Christine was unimaginable. Every month was a public speculation. Her health, her cycle, her diet, everything was a matter of state concern. Charles, deeply in love with his wife, was also a deeply demanding dynastic head. He made her undergo punishing fertility treatments, including strict diets and consuming vast quantities of wine, which he hoped would strengthen her for childbearing. And then, in 1716, it happened. The Empress was pregnant. The court held its breath. On April 14th, the cannons of Vienna fired a salute. A son had been born. The relief was so profound it bordered on hysteria. The empire went wild. He was named Leopold John after his grandfather and his uncle. He was the miracle baby, the answer to every prayer. The crisis was over. The succession was secure. That strange secret document, the Pragmatic Sanction, was now just a curious relic, a testament to a moment of panic. Charles was vindicated. He was not just an emperor, he was the father of the next emperor. He could finally relax. The joy lasted 208 days. The baby, Leopold John, was sickly from the start. He was a frail child, and the court physicians, with their medieval remedies, were powerless. On November 4th, 1716, just 7 months after his birth, the little Archduke died. We cannot possibly overstate the psychological impact of this. For Charles, this wasn't just the tragic death of an infant son. It was God's judgment. It was a dynastic catastrophe. The entire future, which had been so bright and secure just moments before, had collapsed into a tiny coffin. All the old fears, all the anxieties about failure and extinction came roaring back 1,000 times stronger. The ghost of his brother, the shadow of his nieces, the fragility of his entire line, it was all he could see. His wife was pregnant again almost immediately, but the mood was no longer one of joyful anticipation. It was one of white-knuckled, desperate fear. On May 13th, 1717, in the Habsburg Palace, Empress Elizabeth Christine gave birth. The attendants rushed to the emperor. The news was delivered. It was a girl, a healthy, robust, powerfully loud baby girl. They named her Maria Theresa. Charles was, by all accounts, a loving father. He was delighted with his daughter. But as he looked at this child, he didn't just see a daughter. He saw the living, breathing embodiment of his greatest political crisis. That secret document from 1713, the Pragmatic Sanction, was no longer a what if. It was now the single most important piece of paper in Europe. His life from this moment on would have only one purpose, not to have a son, but to make the entire world accept the daughter he had. The obsession began. Charles's other children, a second daughter, Maria Anna, born in 1718, and a third, Maria Amalia, who died in childhood, were loved, but Maria Theresa was his heir. She was his life's work, and now he had to sell his Pragmatic Sanction to the world. He couldn't use force. The War of the Spanish Succession and the subsequent brief war to swap Sardinia for Sicily had left his armies weakened and his treasury barren. He would have to buy acceptance. He would have to trade, to beg, to cajole, and to concede. He would, in essence, put the Habsburg Empire up for auction, selling off pieces of its wealth and power in exchange for a simple signature on his precious piece of paper. He started at home. An emperor's decree meant nothing unless the individual kingdoms, duchies, and estates that made up his patchwork empire agreed to it. He had to go to each of them, cap in hand. He started with his hereditary lands, Austria, Bohemia, and they, after some grumbling, accepted. But then came Hungary. The Hungarian nobility were a famously proud, independent, and rebellious group. They had their own ancient constitution, their golden bull, and they deeply distrusted any whiff of centralization from Vienna. They saw this pragmatic sanction as a Viennese power grab. Why should they accept a female ruler just because the Austrian emperor said so? It took Charles years of hard, painful negotiation. He had to travel to Hungary to be physically crowned with the sacred crown of Saint Stephen. He had to bribe nobles. He had to promise, in return for their signature, that he would forever respect all of their ancient feudal rights and privileges, their tax exemptions, and their political independence. In 1723, they finally agreed. He had their signature. But the price was locking the Habsburg rule of Hungary into a medieval decentralized system that would cripple any attempts at future modernization. He had saved the inheritance for his daughter, but he had also guaranteed it would be a dysfunctional one. One by one, the other territories fell in line, each one extracting its own price. But getting his own people to agree was the easy part. Now he had to face the wolves, the other powers of Europe. He turned first to his old rival, Philip V of Spain, the man who was sitting on the throne. Charles still felt was his. In a bizarre and desperate diplomatic reversal, Charles formed the Alliance of Vienna in 1725. He, the Habsburg emperor, allied with the Bourbon king of Spain. He even provisionally betrothed his young daughters, Maria Theresa and Maria Anna, to Philip's sons. It was a shocking move that terrified Britain and France, who immediately formed a counter-alliance. For a few years, Europe teetered on the brink of another massive war, all because Charles was frantic to get anyone's signature. The alliance eventually fell apart, a confused and failed experiment, but it showed the world just how desperate Charles was. And when you're that desperate, your enemies don't feel pity, they just raise the price. Next, he turned to Britain. Britain, the great maritime power, had one major economic rival it wanted to crush: Charles's new, surprisingly successful Ostend Company. Based in the Austrian Netherlands, Belgium, this company was Charles's pet project, his one great attempt at economic modernization. It was designed to compete with the British and Dutch East India companies, to give his landlocked empire a piece of the lucrative global trade, and the British hated it. So they made him an offer, a cold, hard, cynical offer. In the Second Treaty of Vienna in 1731, Britain agreed to officially recognize the Pragmatic Sanction. They swore a solemn oath to defend Maria Theresa's right to inherit. The price? Charles had to completely and permanently dissolve the Ostend Company. He had to take his own successful, profitable company, his empire's best shot at a modern commercial future, and kill it. He was trading his daughter's economic future for her political future. He was trading real, tangible wealth for a written promise from a government he knew, from his experience in Spain, was deeply untrustworthy. But he needed the signature. He signed. He killed the company. He got his promise. 2 signatures down. But the most dangerous one, the most expensive one, was yet to come: France. In 1733, the King of Poland died. This triggered the War of the Polish Succession. Now, this wasn't really a war about Poland. It was an excuse. France, led by the clever, cautious Cardinal Fleury, saw its chance. This was the moment to bleed the emperor, to strip him bare, and to extract the final agonizing price for their signature on his precious sanction. France backed one candidate for the Polish throne. Charles and Russia backed another. The war was a foregone conclusion. France, allied with Spain and Savoy, declared war on a completely unprepared Austria. Charles's army, neglected for years while he poured money into bribes and diplomacy, was a disaster. His greatest general, the man who had saved Vienna, Prince Eugene of Savoy, was now over 70, frail and past his prime. The French and Spanish armies rolled over the Habsburg lands. They conquered Naples. They conquered Sicily. They overran the Duchy of Lorraine. It was an absolute, unmitigated humiliation. Charles was beaten, and he knew it. He had to sue for peace. The French minister, Cardinal Fleury, was ready with his terms. The Treaty of Vienna in 1738 was Charles's ultimate degradation. France, he was told, would be delighted to finally sign the Pragmatic Sanction. They would swear a sacred oath to protect Maria Theresa. But first, Charles had to give the hard-won kingdoms of Naples and Sicily, the ones he'd received in the last war, to a Spanish Bourbon prince. His Italian influence, won at such cost, was gone. Second, he had to give the vast strategic Duchy of Lorraine on the border of France to Stanisław Leszczyński, the loser of the Polish War. And everyone in Europe knew that Stanisław was the father-in-law of King Louis XV, and that when he died, Lorraine would not go back to its duke. It would be absorbed permanently into France. And here, fate twisted the knife into Charles's heart with a final personal cruelty. The man who was being forced to give up his ancestral homeland of Lorraine was Francis Stephen, the man Charles had handpicked to marry his beloved daughter, Maria Theresa. They had been married in 1736, in the middle of this disastrous war. It was a genuine love match, a rare bright spot in the gloom of the Viennese court. And now Charles VI, in the name of securing his daughter's inheritance, was forcing his new son-in-law, the man he was entrusting with her future, to surrender his own. Francis Stephen was devastated. He argued, he wept, he pleaded. He was the Duke of Lorraine. It was all he had. But Charles was immovable. The Pragmatic Sanction was more important than his son-in-law's birthright. Francis Stephen was forced to sign, trading his homeland for the distant promise of Tuscany. Think of the symbolism. Charles VI was literally trading away the actual tangible land of his own family to secure a paper promise for his daughter's future. By 1738, he had done it. His quest was complete. Britain, France, Spain, Russia, Prussia, every major power had signed. The document was secure. But look at the cost. The empire was broke. The army was a shambles. His one shot at a modern economy was dead. He had lost his Italian territories. He had given Lorraine to France. He had hollowed out his own empire, leaving nothing but a legal shell, all to protect that shell's right to exist. And fate wasn't quite finished with him. In 1737, the Ottoman Turks, seeing this pathetic, weakened empire, attacked. The ensuing war was the final humiliation. His generals were incompetent. His army, underfunded and demoralized, collapsed. In 1739, he signed the Treaty of Belgrade. He was forced to give back almost everything Prince Eugene had won decades earlier. He gave back Serbia. He gave back Belgrade. This defeat broke him. He was 54 years old, but he looked 70. He was a broken, anxious, and deeply melancholy man. He had succeeded on paper, but he had failed spectacularly in reality. He was surrounded by liars who had taken his money and his land, and in return had given him promises he had to know in his heart were worthless. It is in this state, in the gloomy, damp autumn of 1740, that Charles VI decides to go hunting. He is trying to escape the suffocating gloom of his court, the endless reports of his failures. He is a sad, worried man, just looking for a moment's peace. He rides out to his favorite hunting lodge. The hunt is good. He returns tired, chilled, but perhaps for a moment at ease. He sits down for dinner. A hot, steaming fricassee of mushrooms is placed before him. October 10th, 1740, the Habsburg hunting lodge at Favorita. It was a cold, damp day, and Charles VI was chilled to the bone from his hunt. He was 55, but felt much older. He was a man drowning in a sea of paper haunted by the ghosts of lost territories, Belgrade, Naples, Sicily, Lorraine, and the mocking signatures of kings he had paid for their friendship. He returned to the lodge, looking forward to a hot meal, a moment of simple physical comfort to ward off the encroaching melancholy. His chefs prepared one of his favorite dishes, a fricassee of wild mushrooms, very likely death caps, which can be easily mistaken for edible varieties. In that moment, he wasn't an emperor. He was just a tired, hungry man. He ate the dish, perhaps remarking on its excellent flavor. He went to bed. In the early hours of the morning, he awoke in agony. The poisoning was not a gentle slipping away. It was a brutal, violent assault. He was seized by agonizing stomach cramps, intense nausea, and relentless, debilitating vomiting and diarrhea. The court physicians were summoned and they descended in a panic. But this was 1740. Their medical knowledge was a cocktail of superstition, ancient Greek theory, and guesswork. They saw an emperor, pale and sweating, writhing in pain, and they were terrified. They did what they always did. They made it worse. They diagnosed cholera or a chill. They applied hot poultices. They almost certainly bled him, weakening him further. They force-fed him bizarre concoctions. Perhaps theriac, a medieval cure-all made of dozens of ingredients, including sometimes opium and viper's flesh. For 10 days, Charles VI endured an unimaginable hell. The poison, emanatin, was doing its slow, inexorable work, shutting down his liver and kidneys. As the days passed, the horrifying truth began to dawn on the court. This was not a passing illness. The emperor was dying, and he knew it. The Hofburg Palace in Vienna was thrown into absolute chaos. This wasn't supposed to happen. Charles was only 55. He was vigorous. He was supposed to have another 10, maybe 20 years. 20 years to train his daughter, to strengthen his army, to try and undo the damage his obsessive diplomacy had done. But there was no time. There was no time. His daughter, Maria Theresa, was 23 years old. She was intelligent, she was dutiful, she was strong-willed, but her father had committed one of the most baffling and catastrophic errors of his entire reign. In his frantic, lifelong quest to get everyone to accept her title, he had never actually prepared her for the job. Think about this. He had moved heaven and earth to make her his heir, but he had never allowed her to sit in on a council meeting. He had never shown her the state papers. He had never introduced her to his ministers or explained the intricate, broken, and bankrupt state of his own government. She was a complete novice, kept entirely in the dark. Perhaps he did it to protect her. Perhaps he was a micromanager who couldn't let go. Or perhaps in his heart, he still believed that a man would handle it. His chosen man was his son-in-law, Maria Theresa's husband, Francis Stephen. Francis was handsome, charming, and a brilliant businessman. But he was not a Habsburg. He was the Duke of Lorraine, or rather the ex-Duke of Lorraine, the man Charles himself had forced to give up his own country. The Austrian court, deeply xenophobic and proud, viewed him as a foreign interloper, a Franzl. They resented him. Charles had vaguely intended for Francis to be a co-ruler, to help Maria Theresa, but he had never formalized this, never given him any real power. So in that death chamber, as Charles VI faded, there was no clear successor. There was a 23-year-old girl who knew nothing about her own empire, and her unpopular husband who had no legal authority. Charles, in his last lucid moments, was consumed by a terrible clear-eyed dread. He must have seen with horrifying clarity that his entire life's work, his precious pragmatic sanction, was nothing but a worthless piece of paper. He had left his daughter an empty treasury, a broken army, and a pack of legal documents signed by liars. His final words, reportedly whispered to his wife, Elizabeth Christine, were a summary of his entire tragic life. My poor Lisette, you see me in a sad state. I am suffocating, my children, my territories. Oh God, my poor people. He wasn't thinking of his soul. He was thinking of the chaos he was about to unleash. On October 20th, 1740, 10 days after his fateful meal, Charles VI died. The last male Habsburg emperor was gone. The news of the emperor's death, sudden and shocking, spread across Europe like a lit fuse. In every capital, in every palace, the reaction was not one of grief. It was one of opportunity. For decades, the rulers of Europe had been watching Charles VI. They had watched him bleed his empire dry. They had taken his money. They had taken his lands. They had signed his precious piece of paper, all the while snickering behind his back, just waiting for this exact moment. In Berlin, the 28-year-old King of Prussia, Frederick II, received the news. He was a new king on the throne for only 5 months. He was a brilliant, cynical, and utterly ruthless young man. He saw his neighbor Austria as a house in disarray. He had a strong, disciplined army, his father's one great legacy, and an ambition that burned like a fever. He immediately saw his chance. He didn't care about the pragmatic sanction his father had signed. To him, it was just words. He had steel. He began in secret to mobilize his army, his target, the rich, prosperous Austrian province of Silesia. In Munich, the Elector of Bavaria, Charles Albert, was overjoyed. His family, the Wittelsbachs, were ancient rivals of the Habsburgs. He immediately and publicly rejected the pragmatic sanction. He pulled out a flimsy, long-debunked counterclaim. He argued that his ancestor had married a daughter of a previous emperor, and therefore he was the rightful heir to the entire Habsburg inheritance, not Maria Theresa. He even produced a forged will. It was absurd. It was transparent, but it was a legal excuse, a casus belli, and he knew who would back him. In Paris, the aging Cardinal Fleury, the man who had taken Lorraine from Charles, played a double game. He sent a public, flowery message of condolence to the Queen of Hungary, pointedly not calling her Archduchess or Empress. He assured her of France's undying friendship and its sacred commitment to the pragmatic sanction. And at the very same time, he sent secret envoys to Bavaria, promising Charles Albert full military and financial support if he made a bid for the imperial crown. The ancient French policy of divide and conquer, of keeping Germany weak by shattering the Habsburgs, was back on. In Madrid, in Saxony, in Savoy, everywhere. The knives were being sharpened. Every ruler who had signed Charles's paper, every king who had taken his bribes, now looked at that 23-year-old girl in Vienna, alone and unprepared, and saw not a rightful queen, but a carcass to be carved. This was the true brutal legacy of Charles VI. He had spent his life meticulously, obsessively, and desperately building a dam of paper, and the floodwaters of European ambition were about to sweep it away as if it had never existed. And what of Maria Theresa? She was in a state of profound shock. She was grieving a father she had loved. She was, at this exact moment, heavily pregnant with her 4th child. And she was, to put it bluntly, completely terrified. The day her father died, she was plunged into a political ice bath. The doors to the treasury were opened, and she found them empty, absolutely empty. Charles VI had spent every last thaler on his diplomacy, on his pointless wars, on his bribes. The state was not just broke, it was in colossal debt. The bankers were already at the door. Then she called for a report on the army. The generals, shuffling their feet, gave her the news. The army was a shell. It was demoralized from the humiliating defeat against the Turks. It was barely half its on-paper strength. The barracks were empty, the uniforms were in rags, the muskets were rusted, and the magazines were bare of powder. And then she met her ministers. These were her father's men. They were old, they were tired, they were pessimistic, and they saw her as the problem. They didn't see a queen. They saw a young, inexperienced woman, a girl who was an inconvenience, a legal fiction they now had to deal with. They openly advised her to just give up. One of her father's most trusted advisors, Count Zinzendorf, told her to her face that the monarchy was on the brink of a precipice. They urged her to appease the wolves. Offer Bavaria a piece of land, they said. Give Prussia some money. They told her to rely on her allies, on Britain and Russia, the ones who had promised to defend the Pragmatic Sanction. And her husband, Francis Stephen, the man she loved, was of little help. He was panicking too. His advice was to trade. He was a merchant at heart. Give them what they want, he urged. Trade territory for peace. Let's just sell our way out of this. This young 23-year-old pregnant woman in her black mourning dress found herself completely, utterly, and terrifyingly alone. Her father was dead. Her treasury was empty. Her army was a ghost. Her ministers thought she was a failure. Her husband wanted her to surrender. And all around her, the kings of Europe were mobilizing their armies to tear her inheritance to pieces. This was the inheritance of Charles VI. This was the result of 30 years of obsessive, frantic, single-minded devotion to one piece of paper. He hadn't just died in anxiety, he had died bequeathing an apocalypse. Maria Theresa had no money, no army, and no allies she could trust. All she had was that piece of paper, the Pragmatic Sanction, and her own iron will. She had no idea how to rule. She had no idea how to fight a war. But in those first dark, chaotic days, as her father's old ministers wailed about doom and surrender, she found one thing her father, for all his flaws, had given her: an unshakable, almost mystical belief in her right to rule. She was a Habsburg. This was her land. This was her inheritance. And she would not give up one single tiny village. She refused to listen to the old men. She refused to listen to her husband. She dried her tears, she took a deep breath, and she prepared to fight. She would not have long to wait. On December 16, 1740, less than 2 months after her father's death, the message arrived. It was cold, it was blunt, and it was an act of pure predatory aggression. Frederick II of Prussia, without a declaration of war, had marched 30,000 elite troops across her border and invaded her rich, loyal province of Silesia. The War of the Austrian Succession had begun. The piece of paper was on fire. When Frederick II of Prussia marched his army into Silesia in the dead of winter, 1740, he didn't even bother with a proper declaration of war. That was for the old generation. That was for men like Charles VI, who obsessed over legal documents and ancient seals. Frederick was the face of a new, more cynical, more brutal age. He sent an envoy to Vienna, who arrived after the invasion was already underway. He met with Maria Theresa's husband, Francis Stephen. The offer was insultingly simple. "Give me Silesia," Frederick said, "and in return, I will use my army to protect your wife from all her other enemies. I'll even vote for you to become Holy Roman Emperor." It was the logic of a gangster, a protection racket. Nice empire you have here. Shame if something were to happen to it. Maria Theresa, who was just 23, pregnant, grieving, and surrounded by cowardly ministers, received this offer. Her ministers all begged her to accept. "It's just one province. He'll protect us. We have no army. We have no money. Just give it to him." Her husband, Francis, was tempted. It seemed like a good deal. But Maria Theresa, in her first true act as a sovereign, showed the steel that would come to define her. She was apoplectic. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a robbery. This man, this upstart king of Prussia, a title the Habsburgs had only recently and grudgingly recognized, this wicked man, as she would call him for the rest of her life, had broken a sacred oath his father had signed. He had attacked her in her moment of deepest grief. She said, "I would rather have the Turk at my gates and my lands ravaged than ever, ever cede Silesia." She would not. She would fight. But she would fight with what? Her army in Silesia, which numbered only 7,000 men, simply dissolved. They retreated into the fortified towns, and Frederick's Prussians overran the entire province, one of the richest, most populous, and most industrious lands in her entire inheritance, in just 6 weeks. The first crack in Charles VI's paper dam had appeared, and now, seeing Frederick's easy, contemptuous success, the other predators began to move. The dam was not just going to leak, it was about to burst, and this, right here, is the central agonizing question of Charles VI's life. This is the great historical argument that rages around his name. How could he have failed so catastrophically? He had one job, one single solitary job, to pass the inheritance to his daughter, and the moment he died, his life's work evaporated. So, was the Pragmatic Sanction, the document he sacrificed everything for, a brilliant legal tool, or was it one of the most monumental follies in diplomatic history? The argument against Charles is brutal, and it's best summed up by his greatest enemy, Frederick of Prussia. Frederick, a cynic to his core, once wrote that a strong army, a full treasury, and a ruthless will were worth more than all the treaties and signatures in the world. And Charles VI, Frederick's critics say, had done the exact opposite. He had chased the shadow of security, not the substance. He had fixated on paper, on words, on the sacred oaths of kings he knew were his rivals. Let's just look at the balance sheet of his reign. To get Britain's signature, he killed the Ostend Company, strangling his empire's best chance at a modern global economy. To get France's signature, he gave up the strategic, vital Duchy of Lorraine, effectively handing it to his greatest enemy. He also lost Naples and Sicily. To keep the Hungarian nobles happy, he confirmed their ancient medieval privileges, guaranteeing that Hungary would remain a feudal, underdeveloped backwater that he could barely tax. He poured millions upon millions of gulden, not into barracks, not into foundries, not into muskets, but into the pockets of foreign diplomats. He spent a fortune on bribes, on lavish embassies, on subsidies to foreign courts, all to get them to sign a piece of paper. Meanwhile, just to the north in Prussia, Frederick's father, the rough, brutal soldier king, Frederick William I, was doing the exact opposite. He was a miser. He pinched every penny. He built no grand palaces. He spent nothing on art. He poured every single thaler into one thing, his army. He created the most disciplined, the most advanced, the most feared infantry in Europe. When he died, he left his son, Frederick II, a full treasury and a perfect war machine. Charles VI died, leaving his daughter an empty treasury, a broken army, and a file cabinet full of worthless promises. From this perspective, Charles's entire reign looks like an act of profound, almost criminal negligence. He was an idealist, a legalist, a man who believed in ancient rules. In a world that was rapidly becoming cynical and modern, he brought a piece of parchment to a gunfight, and his daughter was the one who paid the price. But there is another side to this story, a more tragic, more human side. What else was he supposed to do? Think about his position. He was the last man, the last male Habsburg. When his son Leopold John died, the dynastic game was over. He knew that without a male heir, his neighbors, Bavaria, Saxony, France, Spain, would all try to carve up his lands, claiming them through their own distant marriages to Habsburg archduchesses. The empire, you have to remember, wasn't a single country. It was a personal collection of kingdoms and duchies, each with its own laws of succession. Without a unifying principle, the moment he died, Bohemia would have gone one way, Hungary another, Austria a third. It would have simply disintegrated. The Pragmatic Sanction wasn't just a plea to foreign powers. Its first and most important job was internal. It was a revolutionary legal document that forced all the different parts of his own empire, Austria, Bohemia, Hungary, to agree for the first time ever that they were indivisible, that they would all stick together and accept the same ruler. Charles wasn't just trying to make Maria Theresa his heir, he was trying to invent a country for her to inherit. He was trying to magically transform a medieval personal union into a modern unified state. From this perspective, the Pragmatic Sanction was the only tool he had. It was the legal foundation. It was the one thing that gave Maria Theresa a right. Without it, she wouldn't have been a queen defending her lawful inheritance from oath breakers. She would have been just one more grasping claimant in a chaotic free-for-all. The sanction gave her the moral high ground. It gave her a flag, a cause to rally her people around. His supporters would argue that his mistake wasn't in seeking the treaties. His mistake was in trusting them. He should have done both, get the signatures and build the army. But he was a man of his age, a pious Baroque emperor who believed in God, in law, and in the sacred word of a fellow king. He simply couldn't comprehend the cold, godless realpolitik of a man like Frederick of Prussia. He was, in the end, a good man, but a bad king for a hard time. But the deepest, and perhaps the most unforgivable controversy of his reign has nothing to do with armies or treaties. It was his failure as a father. He spent 30 years, an entire lifetime, fighting to get the world to accept his daughter's name on a piece of paper. And in all that time, he never, not once, taught her the job. This is the great, baffling human tragedy. Why? Why would he fight so hard for her right to rule and then leave her completely, totally, and dangerously unprepared to do it? Was it chauvinism? Did he, in his heart of hearts, still believe that a woman couldn't rule? Did he think she was just a girl, incapable of understanding the complexities of statecraft? We know he was a product of his time, a time that saw women as vessels for childbearing and dynastic marriage, not as policymakers. Or was it his micromanaging, obsessive personality? Was he a man who simply could not delegate, who had to have his fingers on every lever of power and couldn't bear to share it, even with his own heir? Or, and this is perhaps the most tragic theory, was it a kind of magical thinking? Did he believe that if he didn't prepare her for the job, it meant he would never die? That as long as he was the only one who knew how the broken, complex machine of his empire worked, he couldn't be replaced? Whatever the reason, the result was the same. He left his beloved daughter in the worst possible position, with all of the responsibility and none of the knowledge. She knew nothing of state finance. She knew nothing of military strategy. She didn't even know who her own ministers were. It was this failure, not the empty treasury, not the broken army, but the total lack of preparation, that was his greatest and most personal betrayal. He had built a fortress for her and then died without giving her the keys. And now, as Maria Theresa was still reeling from Frederick's invasion, her father's other friends showed their true colors. The blood was in the water. In France, the 87-year-old Cardinal Fleury, the man who had solemnly guaranteed the Pragmatic Sanction, saw his chance. He had watched Frederick take Silesia with ease. He now declared that technically France had promised to support Charles VI's heir, but since the inheritance was disputed by Bavaria, well, France's hands were tied. It was a disgusting, cynical lie, and it was a green light. In June 1741, France signed the Treaty of Nymphenburg. It was a secret alliance now with Bavaria. The Grand Coalition for the Dismemberment of Austria was born. Spain joined, Saxony joined, Prussia, which had already taken Silesia, now officially joined the alliance dedicated to destroying the rest. The plan was simple, and it was Charles VI's ultimate nightmare after his death. Charles Albert of Bavaria would invade Bohemia, be crowned King of Bohemia, and then, with the votes of France, Saxony, and Bavaria, be elected Holy Roman Emperor, stealing the 300-year-old title from the Habsburgs. Prussia would naturally keep Silesia. Spain would take all the remaining Habsburg lands in Italy, while Saxony would get a piece of Moravia. And France, the mastermind behind it, would gloat over seeing its arch-rival, the Habsburgs, wiped off the map, leaving behind a collection of weak, broken German states that France could dominate for centuries to come. What would be left of Maria Theresa? She would be allowed to retain only the Kingdom of Hungary and perhaps the Archduchy of Austria, reduced from an empress to a small and incapacitated Eastern European queen. This was the true final devastating result of Charles VI's entire life. This was the thanks he got for Lorraine, for the Ostend Company, for his empty treasury. In the summer of 1741, the storm broke. A massive French-Bavarian army surged across the border and into Austria. Maria Theresa's tiny, shattered army couldn't stop them. They didn't even try to take Vienna. They wheeled north into Bohemia. On November 26, 1741, they stormed and captured the great city of Prague. The news was a death blow. Maria Theresa was devastated. This wasn't a distant province like Silesia. Prague was the second capital of her empire. The sacred crown of Bohemia was hers. And then, the final humiliation. In that same city of Prague, Charles Albert of Bavaria, her rival, her family's ancient enemy, had himself crowned King of Bohemia, a title her father had worn. 2 months later, in January 1742, the electors of the Holy Roman Empire met in Frankfurt, and, with the power of French arms and Prussian ambition behind them, they elected Charles Albert of Bavaria as the new Holy Roman Emperor. He took the name Charles VII. For the first time in 3 centuries, the imperial crown was no longer on a Habsburg head. This was the absolute nadir. This was the end of Charles VI's dream. His daughter was 24 years old. She had lost her richest province. She had lost her Bohemian kingdom. And her family had lost the imperial title. She was cornered in Vienna. Her enemies were on all sides. Her ministers were openly telling her to flee to Hungary, to just give up, to surrender everything. It was over. The House of Habsburg was finished. All that was left was a grieving, terrified, desperate young woman who had just given birth to a son, Joseph. She had no army, she had no money, she had no allies. All she had was that one last, desperate gamble. A trip to the one kingdom that had cost her father so much, the one place he had bribed and cajoled, the one people as proud and as stubborn as she was. She pinned all her hopes on Hungary. By September 1741, Maria Theresa was no longer an empress. She was a fugitive in her own capital. The French and Bavarians were marching through Austria. Prague, the jewel of Bohemia, was about to fall. Her ministers, those old men, as she called them, were in a state of open panic, a council of cowards. They saw only one path: surrender. Give Frederick Silesia. Give Bavaria a chunk of Austria. Give the Spanish her lands in Italy. Just make it stop. Maria Theresa was 24 years old. She had a newborn son, Joseph, in her arms. She was, in the words of one British envoy, so low that she would see no one. She was cornered, betrayed, and utterly alone. Except, not quite. She had one last, desperate card to play. It was a wild gamble, a true shot in the dark. It was a trip to the most dangerous, unstable, and fiercely independent part of her entire inheritance. A kingdom that had spent the last 200 years in a near-constant state of bloody rebellion against her Habsburg ancestors. She was going to Hungary. This was the kingdom her father, Charles VI, had spent years negotiating with, the one he had bribed and placated just to get them to sign his Pragmatic Sanction. The Hungarian magnates, the powerful, wealthy, and arrogant nobles, had hated Vienna. They hated German-speaking officials. They hated the Habsburg attempts to centralize power. They had only signed Charles's document in exchange for a guarantee of their own ancient feudal liberties, which mostly meant their right to pay no taxes and to defy the king whenever they pleased. Now her ministers in Vienna were horrified. "Don't go," they begged her. "They're barbarians, they're rebels, they'll kidnap you, they'll hold you hostage and demand more rights." But Maria Theresa understood something her father, with all his legal documents, never did. Her father had tried to buy the Hungarians' loyalty with paper. She was going to win it with blood. On September 11th, 1741, Maria Theresa, Queen of Hungary, stood before the Hungarian Diet. This was not a polished, polite Viennese court. This was an assembly of warriors. These were the great magnates, dressed in furs and velvet, with jeweled sabers at their hips. They were rough, proud, hard-drinking men who respected only two things: strength and tradition. And they were deeply suspicious of this 24-year-old German-speaking girl. She stood before them dressed in deep mourning, a black dress in the traditional Hungarian style. She had been practicing her speech, but she didn't address them in German, the language of their oppressors. She didn't even use French, the language of diplomacy. She addressed them in Latin, the ancient official language of the Hungarian Diet, the language of their own laws and their own constitution. Her speech was a masterpiece of political theater, a raw, emotional appeal that would become the stuff of legend. She didn't try to command them. She didn't lecture them about the Pragmatic Sanction. She threw herself on their mercy. She spoke of her dire and desperate situation. She spoke of being abandoned, betrayed by all. She spoke of the enemies who were attacking the very existence of her, a forsaken queen and her poor, innocent children. She told them that her crown, her lands, her very survival now rested solely on their famed ancient Hungarian valor. The hall was silent. The hardened magnates were stunned. No Habsburg ruler had ever spoken to them like this. They had always been commanded, never asked. And then she delivered the final, devastating, brilliant stroke. With tears streaming down her face, and witnesses debated for centuries whether they were real or tactical. They were probably both. She lifted up her 6-month-old son, the future emperor Joseph II. She held him aloft for the entire Diet to see. "The safety of my person, of my son, and of my crown," she cried, her voice breaking, "I commit to your sole care." The hall erupted. It was as if a dam of centuries of resentment had broken. These proud feudal lords, who had hated her great-grandfather and her grandfather, were completely, totally, and instantly conquered. They were overcome. They saw a beautiful young queen in black weeping, holding her baby, speaking their ancient language, and begging them, the Hungarian warriors, to be her saviors. It was the greatest chivalric fantasy brought to life. The magnates leaped to their feet. They drew their sabers and raised them to the rafters, and they roared in one deafening voice the ancient Hungarian acclamation, Vitam nostrum et sanguinem consecramus. We consecrate our lives and our blood. They were all in. It was the single greatest political gamble of the 18th century, and it paid off spectacularly. The Hungarians, who had been her most likely rebels, now became her most fanatical supporters. They voted to raise a massive new army, tens of thousands of men, wild, fierce, irregular cavalry known as Pandurs and Croats. They were, as one French general would later lament, a vision from hell, a horde of barbarians who fought with a ferocity the polished armies of Europe had never seen. Maria Theresa had done what her father, with all his money and all his treaties, had never been able to do. She hadn't just gotten their signature, she had won their hearts. She had traded her tears for an army. This moment, the insurrection, as the Hungarians called it, changed everything. It was a massive psychological shock to her enemies. They had counted on a quick, easy victory against a weak, defenseless girl. They had expected Hungary to rebel, to be the final nail in her coffin. Instead, this girl had just conjured a fresh, savage army out of thin air. Suddenly, Maria Theresa had hope, and she had rage. She turned her new armies loose. While the French and Bavarians were celebrating their capture of Prague, her generals launched a stunning surprise winter campaign. But they didn't attack Prague. They didn't attack Frederick in Silesia. They marched straight into Bavaria. They struck at the very heart of her enemy, the new emperor. Charles VII, the man who was at that very moment being crowned in Frankfurt as Holy Roman Emperor, received the news. While he was putting on his new crown, Maria Theresa's Hungarian hordes were sacking his own capital city of Munich. It was a humiliation from which he would never recover. At the same time, she sent her diplomats to Frederick of Prussia. She was furious with him, but she was not stupid. She knew she couldn't fight everyone at once. She offered him a secret truce. She would, temporarily, let him have Silesia if he would just get out of the war. Frederick, seeing that his French and Bavarian allies were incompetent and that Maria Theresa was far from beaten, agreed. He was a cynic. He had what he wanted. He pulled his armies out, betraying his own allies without a second thought. Suddenly, the grand coalition was falling apart. With Prussia gone and the Hungarians rampaging through Bavaria, the French army, which was still deep inside Bohemia, was now cut off, isolated, and in deep trouble. The war was far from over. It would rage for another 7 years. It would become a sprawling global conflict with battles in Italy, in the Netherlands, even in North America. But the existential crisis was over. The War of the Austrian Succession was no longer about the survival of Maria Theresa. It was now about the price of Maria Theresa's survival. She would lose Silesia. That was a bitter, permanent wound, one she would never forgive Frederick for. She would also have to give up some of her lands in Italy to Spain and Savoy. The pragmatic Sanction in the end had not been indivisible. Her father's grand legal dream had been partially dismembered. But she survived. She survived. She drove the French and Bavarians out of Bohemia. She had herself formally crowned Queen of Bohemia in Prague, reclaiming her title. Her great rival, the Emperor Charles VII of Bavaria, died in 1745. A broken, humiliated man, a puppet emperor who had lost his own country while chasing hers. And in one of the greatest political comebacks in history, Maria Theresa, the woman they had all dismissed, gathered the votes. And in 1745, she had her own husband, Francis Stephen, elected as the new Holy Roman Emperor. The imperial title was back in the family. The House of Habsburg, or as it would now be known, the House of Habsburg-Lorraine, was saved. This was the ultimate, staggering, and deeply ironic legacy of Charles VI. His life's work, the Pragmatic Sanction, the document for which he had bankrupted his empire and sacrificed his army, had utterly failed. It collapsed the second he died. It didn't prevent the war. It didn't stop the betrayal. It was, in every practical sense, a worthless piece of paper. And yet, the daughter he had left so tragically unprepared, the 23-year-old girl who knew nothing of statecraft, had turned out to be a political and moral genius. She had saved herself. She had done what he, with all his legal maneuvering, could not. She had inspired loyalty. She had shown a courage and charisma that rallied an army from the brink of oblivion. Charles VI, in his obsessive, anxious, and ultimately failed quest, had inadvertently given his daughter the one thing she needed to survive: a cause, a legal and moral right. He gave her the story of a young queen betrayed by oath breakers, defending her sacred, legal, God-given inheritance, which had been guaranteed by all the great powers of Europe. His life's work was a failure in practice, but it was a staggering success in propaganda. And more than that, by some miracle of genetics, this stiff, formal, anxious, and ultimately mediocre king had fathered one of the greatest rulers of the 18th century. He had raised a daughter who possessed all the qualities he himself lacked: charisma, resilience, practicality, and a will of absolute iron. He had spent his life building a hollow, brittle shell, and when that shell shattered, as it was always going to, he had, by the grace of God, left behind a diamond at its center. The war that Charles VI's death unleashed, the War of the Austrian Succession, finally shuddered to a halt in 1748 with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. And when the smoke cleared and the diplomats went home, the map of Europe was, as Charles had always feared, redrawn. The Pragmatic Sanction was, officially, dead. Maria Theresa was forced to formally, and with bitter resentment, cede Silesia to Frederick of Prussia. This was the great bleeding wound of her reign. It was a loss of one of her richest, most populous provinces, and it announced the arrival of a terrifying new rival on the world stage, the Kingdom of Prussia. This single act of robbery, as she saw it, would define the next 100 years of German history, setting in motion the brutal Austro-Prussian rivalry that would one day forge a new unified Germany, a Germany without Austria. She also lost her Italian duchies of Parma and Piacenza to the Spanish Bourbon. Her father's dream of an indivisible inheritance had been proven a fantasy. But Maria Theresa had won. She kept everything else. She kept Austria. She kept the strategic Austrian Netherlands. She kept Milan. She kept the fiercely loyal kingdom of Hungary. She kept the crown of Bohemia. Her husband was Holy Roman Emperor. The House of Habsburg-Lorraine was not just alive, it was secure. She had faced down a coalition of all of Europe's great powers, a coalition designed to erase her from existence, and she had fought them to a standstill. The 23-year-old girl her father had left unprepared, the one whose ministers had told her to flee, was now without question the most respected and formidable woman in the world. And this is the true final significance of Charles VI. He is one of the most important failed rulers in history. His historical impact lies not in what he did, but in what he caused. His obsessive 30-year quest for the Pragmatic Sanction was a political catastrophe. It weakened his empire. It emptied his treasury, and it failed to prevent the very war it was designed to stop. But in failing, it created the conditions for a revolution. Because Maria Theresa, having survived this trial by fire, having seen her father's old system of bribes and diplomacy utterly collapse, knew that she could never, ever rule as he had. She couldn't rely on the sacred word of kings. She couldn't rely on ancient privileges. She had to remake the Habsburg Empire, or it would be torn apart the moment she died. And so began the great Theresian Enlightenment. She spent the next 40 years doing everything her father hadn't. She centralized the government, breaking the power of the local feudal nobles, except in Hungary, her saviors, who remained a privileged exception. She created a new professional bureaucracy, loyal to Vienna, not to their home provinces. She reformed the tax code, forcing the nobles and the clergy for the first time to pay their share, funding a new powerful permanent standing army. She reformed the economy. She reformed the legal system. In short, she took the crumbling medieval personal portfolio of lands she had inherited from her father, and she forged it with her iron will into a modern, centralized 18th century state. She did it all for one reason, not for enlightenment, not for progress. She did it to get Silesia back. She did it to crush Frederick of Prussia. She was in every way her father's daughter, obsessed with a single goal, but unlike him, she built her dream with steel and treasure, not with paper and wax. The empire that Charles VI almost lost became, under his daughter, one of the great dominant powers of Europe, an empire that would endure, in one form or another, all the way until 1918. So what, in the end, is the lesson of Charles VI? It's a story that is, at its heart, profoundly, painfully human. It's a story about anxiety, about a man who saw the future, who saw the one great terrible storm that was coming for his family, and who dedicated every second of his life to preventing it. He was not a stupid man. He was not a lazy man. He was a dutiful, pious, loving father who worked himself into an early grave, all in a desperate attempt to control a future he knew would be brutal. And he failed. His anxiety did not save him. His meticulous plans did not work. His life's work was a testament to the terrifying fact that sometimes you can do everything right or what you think is right, and fate will still find a way to break your heart. But his story is also, in the end, a strange and moving story about love. He loved his daughter. He loved her so much that he bankrupted an empire trying to protect her. And that love, that obsessive, anxious, counterproductive love, ultimately set the stage for her greatness. He gave her a cause. He gave her a story. And in a final, beautiful irony, he gave her, through his own inadequacies, the one thing she needed to become a legend. He gave her a fight. Charles VI spent his life trying to build a perfectly safe, perfectly secure, perfectly legal, and perfectly peaceful world for his daughter to inherit. He was terrified of chaos. He was terrified of war. And then he died from eating a mushroom. His death, in its absurd, mundane tragedy, unleashed the very chaos he had feared. It plunged his daughter into the war he had spent his life trying to avoid. And in doing so, it saved his dynasty. Because that war, that chaos, that trial by fire was the one thing that could forge the girl he had left behind into the empress his empire needed. He was the father who failed to build a wall. And in his failure, he accidentally raised a warrior.